The bitter wind howled through the Ardennes forest, biting at the exposed skin of the weary soldiers. Snow fell relentlessly, blanketing the ancient trees and muffling the distant thunder of artillery. It was December 1944, and for a few fleeting days the impossible seemed within reach. This was the Battle of the Bulge, the last great German offensive, a desperate gamble to turn the tide of World War II, had burst through the Allied lines like a coiled spring unleashed. At its sharpest point, spearheading the charge, was Colonel Joachim Peiper's battle group, a formidable force of tanks and armored vehicles pushing relentlessly westward. Their objective, the vast Allied fuel depots at Antwerp. But even as their engines roared and their tracks chewed through the frozen earth, a chilling truth began to emerge, a truth more insidious than any enemy fire. This wasn't just a story of courage and combat, of tactical brilliance and brutal attrition. This was a story of something far more fundamental, something that underpins every human endeavor, every grand strategy, every desperate hope, resources, specifically fuel, the lifeblood of modern warfare. And Peiper's magnificent, terrifying advance was running on fumes. Every kilometer gained was a kilometer closer to paralysis. Their audacious plan wasn't merely to break through. It was to steal the very means of their continued existence from their enemies. They carried only enough fuel for the initial thrust, banking everything on capturing American supply depots along the way. It was a strategy born not of genius but of dire necessity, a stark confession of their nation's profound industrial weakness. Their gamble seemed to pay off, at least initially. After days of relentless fighting, bypassing stubborn pockets of resistance and pushing his men to their absolute limits, Peiper's scouts stumbled upon a small, unassuming American fuel dump near the village of Honsfeld. Relief, a wave of profound, almost religious gratitude, washed over the exhausted Germans. 50,000 gallons of high-octane American gasoline. It was a lifeline, a reprieve, a miracle in the midst of a frozen hell. Their tanks, thirsty beasts of steel, could drink deeply, their engines could roar back to life, and the advance could continue. For a precious few hours, the impossible dream flickered brighter. But that initial euphoria soon gave way to a dawning, unsettling realization. 50,000 gallons. To the Germans, it was an immense treasure, a vital prize. But to the Americans, it was merely a drop in an ocean. A single, relatively small, forward-deployed cache. This wasn't a main depot. It was just one of many. The true scale of the disparity began to sink in, not just for Peiper's men, but for the entire German command. While they celebrated a mere 50,000 gallons, the Allied forces were operating on an entirely different plane of existence. The United States in particular possessed an industrial might the world had never seen. Their oil fields pumped out millions of barrels of crude every day, and their refineries churned out fuel at an astonishing rate. They weren't just producing enough for their own immense war machine. They were producing so much that they could afford what seemed to the Germans like an unthinkable extravagance, burning millions of gallons of fuel just to deny it to the advancing enemy. Imagine that, setting fire to the very resource you desperately need, simply because you have so much of it that you can afford to waste it, knowing your adversary cannot. This wasn't an accident of war. It was the inevitable outcome of years of strategic bombing and fundamental economic realities. While the Allies, particularly the Americans, had built sophisticated logistical arteries like the Red Ball Express, a relentless convoy system that moved supplies day and night, and even engineered marvels like Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean, delivering fuel directly from England to France, Germany's infrastructure was crumbling. Their synthetic fuel plants, vital for making up for their lack of natural oil reserves, had been systematically annihilated by Allied bombers. Their entire oil output was a mere fraction, a tiny, pitiful fraction, of what the United States alone could produce. Germany's entire offensive strategy, therefore, was built on a foundation of sand, the desperate hope of seizing their enemy's resources. It was a strategy that, by its very design, screamed weakness, not strength. It was a confession that their war machine, for all its initial terrifying power and tactical brilliance, was slowly, inexorably running dry. The discovery at Honsfeld, initially a moment of triumph, quickly became a chilling harbinger of doom. It wasn't just the quantity of fuel. It was the casual abundance, the sheer wastefulness of American supplies. From their overflowing fuel drums to their discarded half-eaten rations that began to chip away at German morale. Propaganda had painted the Allies as weak, decadent, and unprepared. But here, in the freezing forests of the Ardennes, the truth was glaringly obvious. This war, they realized, was not just being fought by brave soldiers and brilliant generals. It was being fought and ultimately decided by the silent, relentless churn of factories, the vast networks of supply lines, and the boundless, almost unimaginable industrial capacity of one side, arrayed against the dwindling, desperate reserves of the other. The true nature of their predicament was only just beginning to unfold. The discovery at Honsfeld, it should have been a moment of triumph for Peiper's panzer grenadiers. 50,000 gallons of captured American fuel, a miracle. But it quickly became a chilling harbinger of doom. It wasn't just the quantity of fuel. It was the casual abundance, the sheer wastefulness of the American supplies that began to crush German morale. Their own propaganda had painted the Allies as weak, decadent, and unprepared. But here, in the freezing forests of the Ardennes, the truth was glaringly obvious. This war, they were realizing, wasn't just being fought by brave soldiers and brilliant generals. It was being fought and ultimately decided by the silent, relentless churn of factories, the vast networks of supply lines, and the almost unimaginable industrial capacity of one side, arrayed against the dwindling, desperate reserves of the other. The true nature of their predicament was only just beginning to unfold. For Peiper's men, that fuel was a reprieve. Their tanks, once roaring symbols of blitzkrieg, had become monstrous, thirsty beasts, consuming fuel at an alarming rate, constantly grinding to a halt. Their very offensive, the spearhead of Hitler's last gamble, was already teetering on the brink of immobility. From the outset, they had been forced to rely on capturing enemy supplies. This strategy, while appearing audacious, was in reality a confession of profound weakness. It meant their future was not in their own hands, but dependent on the enemy's resources, a desperate gamble against overwhelming odds. Every mile gained, every town captured, brought not self-sufficiency, but a renewed, frantic search for the next American fuel dump. Imagine the psychological toll this took. To be told you are fighting a superior enemy, yet to see them leave behind enough fuel to power your entire division for days. To find discarded rations that would be a feast for your own starving troops. It wasn't just the quantity. It was the casualness of it all. This wasn't a desperate enemy clinging to every drop. This was an enemy so rich in resources that what they left behind was still more than what your entire army could hope to produce. While German forces were meticulously rationing every drop of fuel, every bullet, every crust of bread, the Allies operated on a different scale entirely. Take the Red Ball Express, a Herculean logistical effort that was a constant river of trucks, transporting supplies from Normandy's beaches right to the front lines. These weren't just a few trucks. At its peak, the Red Ball Express employed over 6,000 vehicles, driven by thousands of mostly African-American soldiers, working tirelessly, often under dangerous conditions, to keep the Allied war machine fed, armed, and fueled. They moved an average of 12,500 tons of supplies daily. Think about that. 12,500 tons every single day, without fail. And then there was Pluto pipeline under the ocean. It sounds like science fiction, but it was a very real marvel of engineering. A series of underwater pipelines stretching across the English Channel, pumping millions of gallons of fuel directly from England to the Allied forces in France. It was a silent, invisible artery, ensuring a relentless flow of petrol that bypassed vulnerable ships and German U-boats. The very existence of such an audacious project spoke volumes about the industrial might and strategic foresight of the Allies. While Germany struggled to move a few thousand gallons by rail, constantly under threat of air attack, the Allies were pumping millions directly into their tanks and trucks, completely undisturbed. The contrast in fuel production was simply staggering. The United States, a veritable industrial colossus, was producing fuel at a rate that dwarfed the combined output of the entire Axis. American oil production alone accounted for over 60% of the world's total. For Germany, their natural oil reserves were almost non-existent. Their war effort relied heavily on synthetic fuel, produced through complex and energy-intensive processes, primarily from coal. But these synthetic fuel plants, their very lifeblood, had become prime targets for Allied strategic bombing campaigns. Day after day, wave after wave of bombers pounded these facilities, systematically dismantling Germany's ability to produce the fuel it so desperately needed. By the time of the Ardennes offensive, their synthetic fuel production was a mere trickle, a fraction of what was required to sustain a modern mechanized army. The Allies, on the other hand, had so much fuel that they could afford to be wasteful, not out of disrespect, but out of strategic necessity. They burned millions of gallons of fuel not just to move their own forces, but also to deny it to the Germans. When retreating or bypassing German supply points, they would often douse abandoned equipment and fuel dumps with gasoline and set them ablaze, creating infernos that lit up the night sky and sent plumes of black smoke into the heavens. This wasn't wanton destruction. It was a calculated move, a stark demonstration of their abundance, and a deliberate act to starve the enemy of a resource they could not replenish. This act, more than any other, hammered home the brutal truth to the German soldiers. Their enemy possessed an endless supply of the very thing that was choking their own war effort. This abundance wasn't just about fuel. It extended to every aspect of supplies. American soldiers were well fed, often receiving fresh meat, vegetables, and even ice cream, luxuries unimaginable for the average German soldier who subsisted on meager, often stale, rations. The sheer volume of American equipment, from their ubiquitous jeeps and trucks to their M4 Sherman tanks, seemed endless. If a vehicle broke down, it was often easier to replace it than to painstakingly repair it. If a unit ran low on ammunition, more was just a Red Ball Express convoy away. For the German High Command, the reality of this disparity was a bitter pill to swallow. Their grand offensive, designed to split the Allied lines and force a separate peace, hinged on a precarious logistics chain that was already snapping under the strain. Peiper's forces, the elite of the German army, were the first to feel the full, suffocating grip of this logistical strangulation. Their tanks, having consumed their meager reserves and the captured American fuel, eventually ground to a halt. Abandoned along the snowy roads of the Ardennes, these once feared panzers became static targets, monuments to a campaign built on a foundation of wishful thinking and a profound miscalculation of their enemy's industrial might. The lack of fuel didn't just cripple their tanks. It was a poison that seeped into every vein of the German war machine. The Luftwaffe, once the terrifying vanguard of the Blitzkrieg, was largely grounded. Pilots, even if they had planes, lacked the fuel for training, let alone for sustained combat missions. Their once mighty U-boat fleet, which had terrorized Allied shipping in the early years of the war, was now largely confined to port, unable to put to sea. Even their medical services suffered immensely. Without fuel, ambulances couldn't reach the wounded, critical supplies couldn't be transported, and field hospitals struggled to evacuate their patients. The wounded lay in the snow, freezing, waiting for a transport that would never arrive because the trucks had no fuel. The war, therefore, was ultimately decided not solely by the bravery of individual soldiers, nor by the tactical brilliance of their generals, but by the relentless, grinding power of industrial and logistical capacity. It was a war of factories against factories, supply lines against supply lines. The German soldier, for all his courage and discipline, was fighting an enemy that could simply outproduce, outsupply, and ultimately outlast him. The cold, hard truth was that Germany had entered a war it could not sustain. A war against an industrial behemoth whose resources seemed limitless. And as the Ardennes offensive faltered, bogged down not by overwhelming resistance alone, but by the sheer, unyielding reality of empty fuel tanks, the inevitability of their defeat became chillingly clear. The dream of victory, once fueled by audacious tactics and early successes, was now slowly, agonizingly running dry. The dream of victory, once fueled by bold tactics and early wins, was now slowly, painfully running dry. The desperate gamble of the Ardennes offensive, born in a bunker and launched with a prayer, had failed. It wasn't just a tactical mistake. It was a brutal awakening to a fundamental truth of war. Victory isn't just about courage, it's about capacity. Think about it. When Joachim Peiper's men stumbled upon 50,000 gallons of American fuel, it felt like salvation. But that fleeting moment of hope quickly turned into a demoralizing shock. For the fuel-starved Germans, 50,000 gallons was a treasure. For the Allies, it was a minor supply depot, easily abandoned, easily replaced. This discovery wasn't just about fuel. It was a glimpse into a world of unbelievable abundance. A world where 50,000 gallons wasn't a strategic asset, but a minor inconvenience. In stark contrast, the American war machine was a logistical masterpiece. While German panzers sat idle, the Allies moved mountains of supplies with near miraculous efficiency. The Red Ball Express, a testament to human grit, saw thousands of trucks, driven mainly by African-American soldiers, roaring down dedicated highways, delivering over 12,000 tons of supplies to the front lines every single day. But even more incredible was Pluto, pipeline under the ocean. While the Germans were desperately planning to capture enemy fuel, the Allies were literally pumping it across the English Channel. An invisible, continuous artery of liquid energy feeding an entire continent at war. These weren't just supply lines. They were lifelines sustaining every part of the Allied effort. And the fuel itself? By 1944, the United States, with its vast resources and industrial power, was producing a staggering 1.5 billion barrels of oil annually. Germany, crippled by Allied bombing of its synthetic fuel plants, could barely manage 20 million barrels. That's less than 2% of the American output. It wasn't just a gap. It was an abyss. The Allies could afford to be wasteful in a way that baffled their enemy. They'd burn millions of gallons just to keep it from German hands. They poured gasoline over discarded equipment to render it useless. A casual act of destruction that screamed of endless reserves. For the Germans, every drop was precious. For the Americans, fuel was a tool, a weapon, and a symbol of their overwhelming power. This abundance wasn't just a physical advantage. It was a psychological weapon. German propaganda, which painted the Allies as weak and decadent, was completely undermined by reality. When German soldiers captured American positions, they didn't find meager rations. They found overflowing K-rations, Spam, chocolate, cigarettes, and coffee, luxuries beyond their wildest dreams. They found jeeps and trucks, seemingly abandoned, with full tanks of gas. How do you fight an enemy who has so much they can just leave it behind? How do you believe propaganda about scarcity when you're surrounded by evidence of plenty? This so-called wastefulness was a strategic display of power. A silent, relentless message that echoed across the snowy fields of the Ardennes. You cannot win. You cannot outlast us. Germany's entire strategy in the Ardennes was built on capturing enemy supplies. This wasn't a clever plan. It was a glaring admission of their own weakness. It was a desperate Hail Mary from a team that had run out of options. A truly powerful nation doesn't plan a war sustained by its opponent's resources. It plans to sustain it with its own. This reliance on plunder was a confession of crippling inadequacy. And so the lack of fuel became the ultimate Achilles heel. It was the poison that slowly paralyzed the entire German war machine. Without it, the mighty panzer divisions, the very symbols of German military might, became immobile steel coffins. Their air force, the once feared Luftwaffe, was grounded, its pilots helpless spectators as Allied planes dominated the skies, pounding German columns and supply lines without mercy. Their U-boat fleet, which once threatened to starve Britain, was mostly confined to port, a fleet of rusting giants. Even their medical services failed. Ambulances couldn't reach the wounded. Critical supplies couldn't be transported. Wounded soldiers lay freezing in the snow, waiting for a ride that would never come, because the trucks had no gas. The landscape was littered with abandoned tanks, trucks, and artillery monuments to a war effort that had literally run out of fuel. It wasn't just a defeat, it was a total logistical collapse. A systemic failure that made bravery, tactics, and sacrifice meaningless. The war, in the end, was decided not just by soldiers or generals, but by the relentless, grinding power of industry and logistics. It was a war of factories against factories, supply lines against supply lines, and fuel tanks against empty fuel tanks. The German soldier, for all his courage, was fighting an enemy that could simply outproduce, outsupply, and outlast him. Germany had entered a war it couldn't sustain against an industrial giant whose resources seemed limitless. As the Ardennes offensive sputtered to a halt, bogged down by the simple, undeniable reality of empty fuel tanks, the inevitability of defeat became chillingly clear. This story, rooted in the grim reality of war, holds a profound lesson for all of us in every part of our lives. It's a testament to the power of preparation, the critical role of resources, and the importance of the invisible infrastructure that supports our biggest ambitions. Whether in business, personal goals, or just facing life's challenges, we often focus on the visible, the strategy, the talent, the immediate goal. But this tale from the Ardennes reminds us that true, sustained success hinges on the unseen, foundational elements. The fuel, the logistics, the capacity to endure. Just as the Allies knew a steady flow of fuel was as crucial as any battle plan, we must recognize the fundamental resources that power our own journeys. Are we building our dreams on solid ground with sustainable resources? Are we creating robust logistical systems, our habits, our support networks, our planning to make sure we don't run out of fuel when things get tough? Are we truly assessing what it takes to achieve our goals, or are we, like the Germans in the Ardennes, just hoping to get lucky and seize resources from somewhere else? The story of fuel in World War II is a powerful reminder that even the most brilliant strategy can crumble without the means to execute it. It teaches us that true strength isn't just in what we do, but in what we can sustain. It's a call for foresight, careful planning, and a commitment to building the solid infrastructure that will carry us through any challenge. Because in life, as in war, the dream of victory, no matter how bold, can only be realized if we make sure our tanks never, ever run dry. The ultimate victory belongs to those who understand that capacity, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of sustenance are not just footnotes to success, but its very heart and soul. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world. See you next time.